I just start recording, that way if people keep talking, it ends up on the internet. So, we're starting at beginning of chapter 22, like I said. And by way of quick review, Book of Deuteronomy, like we've talked about each night as we've been going through it, is Moses' parting sermon, his parting discourse to the people of Israel as they're camped in the plains of Moab and they're getting ready to cross the Jordan River and go into the land that God has promised to them. And so Moses is going back, he's taking them through the law that they've just received, the teaching they've just received from God. He's going back through the events and the things that have happened to them since they've left Egypt. He's reminding them of these things. He's interpreting these things to them. He's telling them, here's what you need to take from these things you've seen and you've heard. Here's what you need to take from them and take with you as you go into this land that God is giving you. And we're starting here in chapter 22, and we're sort of in the middle of a section of a whole bunch of sort of individual laws or individual principles that Moses is going back through that mostly come out of the second half of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers that we've already discussed. But he's coming back to them and reminding the people of Israel about them. So chapter 22, verse 1. If you see your brother's ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it, but be sure to take it back to him. If the brother does not live near you, or if you do not know who he is, take it home with you and keep it until he comes looking for it. Then give it back to him. Do the same if you find your brother's donkey or his cloak or anything he loses. Do not ignore it. Okay, so this is, an object lesson here, obviously, if you see livestock wandering around. But the principle is that morality, the way God calls us to act, is not just a matter of avoiding doing certain things, but it's proactive. It means we have a responsibility to the other people around us. Okay? It's not just that we don't steal our neighbor's cow, but if we see his cow wandering around and we know it's his cow, we go and we get it and we bring it back to him. Or if we can't bring it back to him, we take care of it for him until he shows up. Okay? So this is the opposite of finders, keepers, losers, weepers. Right? Okay? This is we're to go out of our way. We're to go out of our way to help our neighbor. And that continues in verse 4. If you see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. Help him get it to its feet. And now verse 5. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. Well, first of all, what does that have to do with what just came before? First, we're talking about lost donkeys and donkeys falling into ditches, and now we're talking about cross-dressing. That doesn't seem to be directly related. Well, the idea here about wearing men's clothing and women's clothing, and you have to remember, at this point in history, it's not like they had dresses and slacks, right? This is the Bronze Age, okay? The idea here is it's talking about men attempting to appear as women and women attempting to appear as men with the purpose of luring someone of the same gender into a sexual liaison. That's what this is aiming at. This is aiming at a man dressing as a woman to try to seduce another man. Or a woman dressing as a man to try to seduce another woman. Okay? Well, how does that relate to what came before? Well, it's the same kind of idea. You are, by doing this, attempting to gratify yourself and ensnaring another person. You're ensnaring another person by trying to trick them or lure them or convince them to enter into a kind of relationship that they're not to enter into, that's going to be harmful to them. Okay. So this isn't saying, as it's sometimes interpreted, Scotsmen can't wear kilts and women can't wear pants. That's not what this is aimed at. Unless they're doing so with the intent of carrying out a homosexual liaison. Okay. Verse 6, if you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either in a tree or on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, do not take the mother with the young. You may take the young, but be sure to let the mother go, so that it may go well with you, and you may have a long life. Okay, what's that about? Okay. The idea here is that there is something good and holy built into creation about motherhood. Okay. That a mother, and we talked about this earlier when we were talking about some of the other rules about sexuality back in Leviticus. But the pinnacle of what human beings can do, from the perspective of especially the first 5 books of the Old Testament, okay, the pinnacle of what human beings can do to cooperate with God in bringing life into the world is a mother giving birth to a child. Okay, this is the greatest privilege that there is that God has given to human beings from the perspective of the first 5 books of the Bible. So even when it comes to birds, right? Even when it comes to animals, God is saying we need to show respect for that. Okay? So you don't go to the mother hen sitting on her eggs, wring her neck to eat her for lunch, and then crack the eggs and eat them for breakfast. Okay? Even in the animal world, we show respect for that bond that's really seen as sacred. It's really seen as sacred. Okay. And this is directly related, of course, to why the church sees the Theotokos, sees the Virgin Mary as the pinnacle of sainthood, because she cooperated with God in not just bringing a human life into the world, but bringing life itself into the world, Christ himself into the world. And so there's a verse that we'll get to in about 5 years where St. Paul says, woman will be saved by childbirth. And you look at it and go, what? That's what this is referring to. That's what this is referring to. It's referring to the Theotokos. It's referring to this idea of motherhood, right? Of bringing life into the world and participating with God in doing so. Verse 8, when you build a new house, make a parapet around your roof. Now that's what this translation has. I think the Orthodox Study Bible says put a railing around it. Railing. Yeah. Put in a railing. Okay. So that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from the roof. The idea being, again, you need to go out of your way to help and to protect your brother.
Is that the EPA there?
American with Disabilities Act, yeah. It is your responsibility to go out of your way to make sure that the people around you are safe, are protected, don't come to harm. It's not my fault. And this is hearkening back, of course, to the story of Cain and Abel. Right? Cain kills his brother. God comes to Cain. Where's your brother? Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? Am I in charge of him? I don't know. Okay. We're responsible not just for not directly doing harm to people, not coming and shoving them off the roof. Okay. We also, when we're building the house, need to put a railing on the roof so that they don't fall. We do not put stumbling blocks in people's paths. Okay. And that's our responsibility to take that extra step. Verse 9, do not plant 2 kinds of seeds in your vineyard. If you do, not only the crops you plant, but also the fruit of the vineyard will be defiled. And then it continues in verse 10, do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. Verse 11, do not wear clothes of wool and linen woven together. Okay, what's that all about? Today, a lot of Orthodox Jews take these commands literally and, for example, will not wear a cotton polyester blend. Okay? Because it's two different kinds of cloth blended and woven together. That's not the core. That's not the core of what God is getting at here. All three of these are examples of taking two unequal and unrelated things and trying to bring them together. We talked about in Leviticus how through the whole idea of uncleanness, God was trying to teach the people through object lessons. Through ideas like hygiene, he was trying to teach them about sin. Right? He was giving them very concrete things to do. Okay, you understand that when you do this, you get dirty, you need to clean yourself. In the same way, when you commit this sin, you get morally dirty, you need to be morally clean. Right? You need to be cleaned in your soul. The same idea is what's going on here. Okay? It's not so much don't wear a cotton polyester blend, it's don't marry a Moabite, for example. Right? St. Paul will say don't be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. He's referring to the donkey and the oxen. Right? You can't take these two things that are different and try to put them together and try and make it work. Like we talked about before when it said don't put Asherah poles next to the altar of God, right? You can't take another religion and the true religion, the worship of God, and squish them together and try and make it work. Okay. It doesn't work that way. And so he's giving them real tangible examples to show them, this won't work in your everyday farm life. This won't work when you're making clothes for yourself and your family. This also won't work as you're living your life in the world. And finally, in verse 12, make tassels on the four corners of the cloak you wear. Now remember, that's going back. Those tassels were to be put on the clothing as a reminder so that every time you see them, you remember the commandments of God. Okay? They were there for no other reason. Okay, so when you saw your garments and you saw these tassels, the idea is that you would look at them and remember, I need to keep the commands of God. If you look closely, I noticed this actually last Sunday when we were doing the church tours. If you look at the stained glass window and you look at Moses, he's lifting the one hand so you can see his garment underneath. And down at the bottom you can see the tassels at the end of the robe. So these are the tassels that they're talking about. And Christ is later going to, condemn the Pharisees, because the Pharisees are going to go out and get their garments and they're going to put big long tassels, right? Big long ornate tassels. So everyone sees, see, we're obeying the rules, right? And again, that's not the point. The tassels are there for you. The tassels are there to remind you about what you should be doing, not to show other people what you may or may not be doing.
Not sure how to bring this about, but when you're talking about mixing things, and you said about the worship service really comes out of the Old Testament, okay, Deuteronomy. If you bring that forward to the Puritans, their argument was very much like this, that we are mixing with the churches of England, who happen to have, let's say, a crucifix or a cross. They genuinely bow. It's not found in the Bible. So therefore, the Anglicans are, if you will, heretics. How do you speak to that and address that in the religious worship service?
The question was about the Puritans, who sort of, in the English tradition, took this approach toward what we would call high church Anglicanism. They saw the Church of England as essentially a compromise between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, and compared it to this kind of thing, two things woven together that don't go together. I would. It's hard to historically disagree that the Church of England is a compromise between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. So I wouldn't necessarily disagree with them there. I think the problem, though, is with their whole view of Scripture in the first place. Because again, bowing isn't found in the Bible. Well, maybe if you read the New Testament very literally, you could make a case that there's no bowing in worship. It's hard to make a case from the Old Testament that there's no bowing in worship. And so part of the problem there is that and this is true in general, and it comes out of Martin Luther, really. Martin Luther drew this rigid distinction in the Scriptures between the law and the gospel. And because of that, it caused, in virtually every form of Protestantism, an inability to see the true connectedness and continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, it's worse in some forms of Protestantism than others. Okay, I mean, there are certain schools of Protestantism that are now focused almost entirely on eschatology, on the end times. The rapture was supposed to happen again on Friday.
Yeah.
And it didn't. So either we got left or it didn't happen.
That makes watch this year the world's
yeah.
to come to an end for me.
So, and those, they're what are called dispensationalists, without going into a lot of detail on that here. They basically say that there's no connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And there's no connection between the people of Israel and the church. They're two different things.
How can they do that?
Well,
I interrupt you. I don't understand. They're all looking at the same book, aren't they?
Right. Well, I don't want to get into that too much here.
Okay.
We'll get into that a little more later on when it pertains a little more. But so ultimately, what they're arguing is that the church, the Orthodox Church's approach to the Bible, is trying to put together two things that are dissimilar: the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's what it comes down to. And I would argue that the church's position has always been that they aren't two different things. They aren't two different things. And we are actually later tonight, toward the end, we're going to touch on this a little bit, in the sense that it's going to be brought out pretty directly, the way that Deuteronomy foresees the New Testament. It's not like the Old Testament is going on, and then the New Testament happens and everything changes and we're all confused. Right? It fits. It fits together, it makes sense together, it's part of one flow. So we'll be returning to that at the end. If I don't answer it satisfactorily when we get there, let me know. Okay, so verse 13 of chapter 22. If a man takes a wife and after lying with her, dislikes her and slanders her and gives her a bad name, saying, I married this woman, but when I approached her I did not find proof of her virginity. Then the girl's father and mother shall bring proof that she was a virgin to the town elders at the gate. The girl's father will say to the elders, I gave my daughter in marriage to this man, but he dislikes her. Now he has slandered her and said, I did not find your daughter to be a virgin. But here is the proof of my daughter's virginity. Then her parents shall display the cloth before the elders of the town, and the elders shall take the man and punish him. They shall find him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the girl's father, because this man has given an Israelite virgin a bad name. She shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her for as long as he lives. If, however, the charge is found true, and no proof of the girl's virginity can be found, she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of the town shall stone her to death. She has done a disgraceful thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. You must purge the evil from among you. A couple notes here. Remember, whenever we see these death penalties, that this is coming within the context of the sacrificial system. Okay? So it isn't as if every girl who slept with someone before marriage got stoned to death. Okay? But in this kind of situation, she would be divorced. She would be returning to her father's house, and her father would have to go and offer sacrifices as a ransom for her life, for her not to be stoned to death, to make atonement for the sin that she had committed. Okay? But the more important part is the first part. See, it starts with It starts with what you do when there's a false accusation. Because it's foreseeing a certain way that men will behave. Right? A man will get married, right? He'll be married to this woman. He'll decide he doesn't want to be married to her anymore. Right? He's going to want an excuse to get a divorce. So he's going to go out and say, well, when I married her, after I married her, I found out she wasn't a virgin. She was sleeping around. To try and get a divorce. Okay? Now this gets a little grisly, but we have to remember this is the Bronze Age. Okay, it's not our time. But at this time, in order to verify that the woman was a virgin, after the marriage, you hear a lot of references in the Bible to the bridal chamber. Okay? The marriage would happen, there would be a feast, and then the married couple would retire to the bridal chamber, okay, where they would have sex for the first time, consummate the marriage. Okay? They would do so with a special cloth on the bed. And that cloth was there to get stained by the woman's blood. Because if she was a virgin and she was making love to someone for the first time, there would be that emission of blood. Okay? And then that cloth would be given to the parents. I know it's creepy by our standards. But that cloth would be given to the parents, and the parents would have it. So that if later the guy tried to pull this, tried to come out and divorce her and slander her good name by saying she'd slept around before marriage, the parents could come before the elders of the city and say, see, we have this cloth that proves she was. And then this guy gets nailed for a fine. That fine, by the way, is about 2.5 pounds of silver. Okay, so you can imagine, how much of a fine that was for making that kind of accusation. And not only did he receive that fine, but he couldn't divorce her. Okay. Now you may be wondering, well, why would she want to stay married to this guy right after he tried to pull this? Well, remember again, we're dealing with a society where polygamy exists. So it's not expected here that he and she are necessarily going to be lovey-dovey and romantic or something in the future after he's tried to pull this. The point is, he's financially responsible for her for the rest of her life. Okay? So not only does he have to pay this fine to her father for having slandered her, he still has the responsibility to take care of her, no matter how much he's decided he dislikes her, for the rest of her life. So the focus here is putting this huge onus of responsibility on men. On men. Okay. This was not true in the other cultures in the Bronze Age. Okay, in the other cultures in the Bronze Age, remember, women were essentially property. Okay, getting rid of a wife or trading her to another guy was like trading cattle. Okay. Here, men have a responsibility. Okay. Unless the woman was, committing adultery or promiscuous before they were married and lying to him, unless she was sinning somehow. Okay, if she's innocent, he's responsible to take care of her for the rest of her life. Okay. Closest thing we have to that in our current law is laws concerning paternity. If a woman could prove that a child is a man's son, he's required by law to provide for that child until the child's an adult. That's the most similar thing we have in our current law. Okay. So now in verse 22, if a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel. The main difference here between what's practiced here and what's practiced in the other culture is the man is stoned to death too. Okay. You'll notice in the story with Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, nobody's trying to stone any man. Right? This woman is caught in adultery and they're trying to stone her to death. Where's the man? Okay. This part of the law is saying the man just as responsible and deserving of the same penalty. And as we see from that story in Christ's life, wasn't followed even hundreds of years later. They blamed the woman.
But then, not counting the story with Jesus, but if a man and a woman, she was married and he was married, and they married to different people, and they slept together, and you went out and stoned both of them to death.
Right, both of them,
Both
yeah.
would die.
Right, or both of them were liable to come and make the sacrifices and repent and atone for what they've done, or be stoned to death or exiled from the people. Okay. Verse 23, if a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The girl because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a girl pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the girl. She has committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders his neighbor. For the man found the girl out in the country, and though the betrothed girl screamed, there was no one to rescue her. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, which is about 1¼ pounds of silver. He must marry the girl, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Okay, so here's 3 cases. What's going on in the first part about the screaming and being in a town? You got to remember, towns weren't like Charleston. Right? In Charleston, 2 people could be doing something inside a house, and the people, the next door neighbors, don't necessarily know what's going on. Okay? You gotta think of a town where you're living nearly on top of each other. In this case, they're in camps, they're in tents. Right? Okay? So what this is saying is, if a woman is betrothed to someone and she gets caught sleeping with somebody else, okay, this is happening in the camp with people around. Okay, she can't make the excuse, well, he forced himself on me because, she could have gotten help. There are people all around, right? Okay. But if a man goes and does this out in the country, meaning not in this situation, where he does something where she is helpless and he rapes her, she's treated like an innocent victim. That's why it's compared to a man murdering someone. The person he murdered didn't do anything. Okay? She's an innocent victim, and just the man is stoned to death. In both cases, these are engaged women in those 2 cases. The difference being in other Bronze Age cultures, if a woman who is engaged to someone slept with someone else, they were just killed. And it was the woman, because she broke a promise. The man wasn't engaged to anybody. So we get away with it. Notice again here, in God's law, in both cases, the man gets stoned to death. Okay? And the woman has only sinned if she was a willing participant. Okay. That's the difference. And then in the last case, this is one, again, that a lot of people bring up about the Bible. The Bible requires a rape victim to marry the person who raped her. Well, again, like I was talking about before, we're dealing with a polygamous society. What this is really saying is, if you take a woman's virginity, you're on the hook to provide for her for the rest of her life. And for her children, if they're your firstborn children, are going to be your heirs, whether you like it or not. Because the man made the choice to do that. Okay? So God is, again, He's putting, as we've seen time and time again here in the law, He's putting restrictions, He's putting responsibilities on the people who have power in this society. On men, on rulers, on judges. He's talking to the people who have power, and He's putting restrictions and responsibilities on them so that they can't abuse the other people, the helpless people, the people who don't have legal rights in this culture. And finally, in verse 30, a man is not to marry his father's wife. He must not dishonor his father's bed. Okay. Chapter 23, we get a slight change in theme. We're still going through the rules, but these are a little different. Verse 1, no one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord. That's kind of a brutal way of putting it. I think the Orthodox Study Bible has no one who's a eunuch, or or it's been castrated. It's a little nicer than the crushing and the cutting.
Wounded in the stone.
Oh, is that the King James? Wounded in the stones?
Wounded in the stone.
Okay. Okay, well, what is this? What does this enter the assembly of the Lord mean? Okay, enter the assembly of the Lord means come to worship God. Okay, so is this saying some poor guy who fell on a rock, when he was 12 and injured himself in the genitals? Sorry, Charlie, you're going to hell. You can't go and worship God. That's not what it's aimed at. That's not what it's aimed at. The eunuchs that they're talking about were Egyptian religious functionaries. Okay? They were generally made eunuchs because they tended to be around Pharaoh's wives, and he wanted to make sure that nothing happened while they were around his wives. And so he made sure nothing could happen while they were around his wives. But this is aimed at these religious functionaries. This is essentially what this is aimed at is the priests of these pagan gods can't come and can celebrate here at the temple of God, in the worship of God. Okay? There's no crossover there. Okay. Now I'm going to expand on that a little as we go forward. Number 2, in verse 2, no one born of a forbidden marriage, nor any of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation. That forbidden marriage, literally means someone illegitimate. Okay, so does that mean if your parents weren't married, tough luck, can't worship God? Verse 3, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt, and they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor and Aram Naharaim, to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Do not seek peace or good relations with them as long as you live. Do not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. Do not abhor an Egyptian, because you lived as an alien in his country. The 3rd generation of children born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. Okay. What this is getting at is, remember we've talked about already that someone who comes, and if they're male are circumcised, or if they're female marries an Israelite, and comes and becomes part of the nation of Israel, and worships the God of Israel, they're an Israelite. Okay. So the people they're talking about are people who have not become Israelites. Okay. So if you are a Moabite, or you're from Moab, and you decide you want to worship the God of Israel, and you come and you're circumcised, okay, and you follow the laws and the teachings of God, and you come to worship God, you're not a Moabite anymore. You're an Israelite. Okay? You're no longer a Moabite. So, what this is saying is, if people are going to come and be in Israel, and come and participate in the worship of God, they need to become Israelites. They need to become Israelites. They can't remain as they are. With the exception of Edomites, because they're descended from Esau, right? They're close relatives. And remember, Esau was also circumcised. And the Egyptians The Egyptians, remember, a group of Egyptians came with them out of Egypt and became part of the nation of Israel and had been traveling with them this whole time. Okay. Talk about the third generation. They're on the second generation right now. Okay. They can come in. This passage here, this idea, is what's going to start the big controversy that we read about in the book of Acts. Okay. Because portions of the church there at the very beginning, including some of the apostles, are going to take the position, well, if these people are going to become Christians, these Greeks and Romans and Scythians and et cetera, if they're going to become Christians, they have to become Jews. Because here it says they can't come in remain as they are. Okay. And St. Paul, and eventually St. Peter, when he comes around, are going to say, no, they can come in as they are now. Okay. But they're going to argue that, they're going to argue for that based on the idea that the circumcision and these symbols of becoming part of the people of Israel have now been transformed because of Christ. Okay. So now we don't have circumcision, we have baptism. Okay. But the church is still going to say someone who hasn't been baptized can't come and receive the Eucharist. Can't come and receive communion. Someone who hasn't been baptized can't get married in the church. Someone who hasn't been baptized. If you haven't become a Christian, okay, you're welcome to be a guest. You're welcome to be a guest at the services of the church, to learn from them. But you can't fully participate until you become a Christian. Okay? So St. Paul isn't going to say that this passage is wrong. He's just going to say that it applies differently now. That it's not circumcision and the particulars of Judaism that they have to follow, but it's that they have to become part of the church. Does that make sense? So verse 9, when you are encamped against your enemies, we've got another transition here. When you're camped against your enemies, meaning when you go out to war. So this is talking about the soldiers who are camped, they're on their way to battle, they're preparing for battle. Keep away from everything impure. If one of your men is unclean because of a nocturnal emission, he is to go outside the camp and stay there. But as evening approaches, he is to wash himself, and at sunset he may return to the camp. Designate a place outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourself. As part of your equipment, have something to dig with. And when you relieve yourself, dig a hole and cover up your excrement. For the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and to deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy so that he will not see among you anything indecent and turn away from you. So what's that all about? God has to teach him how to dig a latrine. That's not again what this is aimed at. We've talked before about how the common view of cultures in the Bronze Age and even before, okay, was that you had the camp, you had home, okay, place where you lived. Outside of that, you had hunting parties, war parties would go out, and when you were not within the camp, the rules don't apply. Remember, we talked about that. So when you're at home in the city, you can't kill someone who you happen across and steal his belongings. If you're out in a war party and you run into someone, you could kill him and steal his belongings. And that's okay because it's outside the camp, right? So the people who aren't us, everybody who isn't us, all of the thems out there, aren't people in the same sense. The rules don't apply to them in the same sense, okay? And I mentioned several places where God is saying the rules still apply. That's what this is aimed at. That's what this is aimed at. Remember, we talked about how in Leviticus, and I brought it up again a little bit ago, that in Leviticus, God uses this whole idea of clean and unclean. to try to, as a real practical way to get your hands on the idea of sin. The idea that I've done something that's put a stain on my soul. You know, connecting that to the idea of I've just gone and done something that's put a stain on my body that needs to be cleaned or washed. Okay? And so that's what, as we see it in the summary, for the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you, to deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy so that he will not see among you anything indecent and turn away from you. Doesn't mean if God sees human feces, he's horrified and runs away, right? That's an example. That's an example. He's comparing the immorality that would go on one of these war expeditions to excrement. That's the comparison that's happening here. Okay, that's the connection that's being made. None of that excrement needs to go on when you're out in one of these war parties, even when you're out making war. Yes.
Just a small commentary. If one were not a believer, in the last couple of chapters that we have reviewed, one would have a question: did God really write this, or did man the influence? But when we come to what you have just spoken of, okay, and then you realize the diet of Israel, they are healthier, they are hardier, they are cleaner, and they would be awesome in battle compared to the diets and lifestyles of other people. Then I would have to say, yes, this is the true word of God, because they didn't know at that time about, I mean, they might have known about diseases, don't get me wrong, but even to this day, when we go to third world countries, we see so many diseases that really could be taken care of simply by redirecting the water, simply by, yes, digging a latrine.
Yeah. Right, we think this is rudimentary stuff, dig a latrine. Yeah.
Nothing has changed.
In the Bronze Age, not rudimentary.
Right.
Yeah, in the Bronze Age, this kind of stuff is revolutionary, these ideas. Yeah. They seem sort of duh to us, you know, now in our modern age, in the first world, in the United States, you know, in the 21st century. But you don't have to go very far to find places where they still aren't.
As a matter of fact, it just came to my mind. There was a meeting in West Virginia. It's where the Civil War soldiers went to heal their wounds, some sort of glades or something like that. It's a marshy area, very beautiful. Forgive me the name, but they had porta-johns, and the porta-johns, some of them leaked, and the whole encampment, and all the women were, many of them, PhDs, well-educated, the whole thing, and how they came down very, very ill. This is maybe 10, 15 years ago.
So that's where that is going. Okay, God's rules always apply. Your responsibilities are the same. Okay. Verse 15, if a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand him over to his master. Let him live among you wherever he likes, in whatever town he chooses. Do not oppress him. Okay. You need to write this verse down. Deuteronomy 23, verse 15, if you need to write it down. The next time someone comes to you, as they're prone to do, especially nowadays, it says, well, the Bible says slavery's okay. Take them to this verse. Not only does it not say it's okay, it says if an escaped slave comes to you, do not give him back. That do not oppress him really means do not enslave him yourself. Meaning he's not your slave now either. Let him live wherever he wants, meaning he's free. Okay? So the Bible does not in the New Testament, not here in the beginning of the Old Testament, nowhere does it say slavery is a good or acceptable thing, that for one human being to own another human being.
I had the most interesting experience years ago. I was working at Smithsonian in the library, cataloging sort of a booklet. from 1840, an argument in favor of slavery at the National Convention of one of the churches. This guy did everything right except for one thing. He went back to the original text of the Bible. He showed how the word servant meant slave. He looked at historically, he went back to the original Greek and Hebrew. By the time he finished, he was actually arguing that it was a sin to set other people's slaves free because you were coveting your neighbor's servant. This guy did everything right except for one thing. He read the Bible without love. I never forgot what I learned that day. I made a point of reading the whole thing during my lunch hour.
Yeah. Now that's a good point, because that's not to say that there haven't been people who have argued for slavery and just about every other form of evil and injustice in the world from the Bible. Because you could take the Bible, especially if you pull things out here and there and pick pieces out, you know, and set them up in a certain way to make it say pretty much anything you want on any given topic.
Every single verse in the Bible, he put them in context.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
If that's your goal. So, yes, that is a good point. We do have to accept that there were people who argued for slavery from the Bible. Okay, there were people who did that. There were people who made what are really convincing arguments. Right? Now, ultimately, we disagree with them. Okay, and ultimately, that's not what the Bible says.
No,
okay?
no.
But the Bible can be made to say things other than what it says. And so when someone comes to us and says, well, the Bible says slavery's okay, you know, usually they're reacting to the way people have interpreted the Bible to them in the past. Right? What they really mean is they don't like the way people have been beating them over the head with the Bible in the past. And this is one of their gotchas as to why the Bible's bad. Okay? And so we need to make that point, that there's a difference between what the Bible actually says and what people have used it for. What people have used it for in the past. Because people have used it to do horrible evil. Okay. So verse 17. No Israelite man or woman is to become a temple prostitute. You must not bring the earnings of a female prostitute or of a male prostitute into the house of your Lord, the Lord your God, to pay any vow, because the Lord your God detests them both. Now this, I think the Orthodox Study Bible has of a prostitute or of a dog. Yeah. Okay, that's in the Greek. Okay, this is a comparison being made. It's a comparison being made. Remember, dogs, I love dogs. We have 2 dogs. We have these feelings of affection and love towards dogs as man's best friend, you know, in America. In the Middle East, even to this day, dogs are not seen that way. Largely. Dogs are seen as sort of scavengers. They're sort of like big rats. Okay? So the idea here is that someone who willingly goes and becomes a prostitute, whether it be just for money or whether it be a temple prostitute for one of these other gods, is behaving not just like an animal, but is behaving like a dog. Is behaving like a dog. And so there's no difference between the amount of money you get for selling a dog and the amount of money one of these people would make from their prostitution. So this is saying, obviously this is anti-prostitution. The idea here is not, you know, prostitutes are evil. If you catch a prostitute, kill her, or him, in this case. The idea here is, do not go and become a prostitute. Right? Do not go and become a prostitute. Verse 19. Do not charge your brother interest, whether on money or food or anything else that may earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but not a brother Israelite, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you put your hand to in the land you are entering to possess. Well, let's get into the topic of usury. Okay, usury means lending money at interest. It's what our society is founded on here in America, literally. And until about the 1600s was considered a sin, and people were excommunicated for doing it. It's one of the kind of strange transitions in the history of Western civilization. Now this clause here, that you can lend money to a foreigner at interest, okay, caused something curious to happen in Western Europe, which was the Christians of Western Europe were not allowed to lend money at interest. Okay? And so by and large, since there was nothing in it for them, they didn't lend money, right? Because you couldn't make anything at it. Right? You're not going to become a banker or a money lender if you can't make a profit. Okay? The Jews living in Europe weren't allowed to lend money at interest to other Jews, but were allowed to lend money at interest to Christians in Western Europe. Okay? And so because they were the only ones allowed to do it, all of the wealthy banking houses of Western Europe were started by the Jewish members of the society. Now the sad truth is that then when we get into the Middle Ages, because of the wealth they had amassed by being bankers, the Jews came to then be resented by the Christians around them for having acquired all this money through usury. And so that began the persecution of Jews throughout Western Europe, which of course climaxed with Hitler in the 20th century. Okay. But most of it stems directly from this, and from that little clause, you can lend money at interest to a foreigner. Okay. Now, it's hard to really address the topic of usury because, again, the church hasn't ever officially changed its stand to say that usury is okay. Especially that it's okay to lend, for one Christian to lend another Christian money at interest. Okay, technically speaking, and Christ said don't do it. Christ said not only that, he said don't lend, he said just give people money. You know, if your brother needs money, don't lend it to him, give it to him. Don't expect it back, right? But our entire American society is built on usury, right? Whether it's student loans, credit cards, you know, home mortgages, car. I mean, I only know one person in my entire life who I've ever seen buy a car cash. You know, so we're placed in, as American Orthodox Christians, we're placed in an interesting situation regarding the morality of it. We could definitely say it behooves us to not be like me and accumulate as little debt as possible. Right? It behooves us to not indebt ourselves unnecessarily. Right? And it definitely behooves us, if we see someone in need, not to lend them money at interest, but to just give them help. And to give them money. And to not try to turn a profit, you know, off of helping other people. That said, there's no way we're going to be able to avoid borrowing money at interest in some situations. In some situations. And so we have to do the best we can in our society. Conduct ourselves as morally as we can. Ourselves, not be greedy and try to profit from other people.
Not quite historical. Until recently, the United States was the country that loaned money rather than the country that borrowed it. In other countries, they nicknamed us USARES, USARERS, because they owed us all this money.
Yeah, well, and we're
The other way around.
yeah. Well, yeah, and then our country itself, yeah,
As a country.
has been first loaning and now borrowing money at interest. Yeah. Verse 21, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to pay it, for the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from making a vow, you will not be guilty. Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do, because you made your vow freely to the Lord your God with your own mouth. This is the danger of filling out a pledge card. So what this is saying is not only if you say you're going to do something, okay? If you say do we need to do it? We need to not be slow in doing it. We need to not drag our feet. We need to not procrastinate like I usually do. Right? We need to get to what we said we would do and do it. Okay? Because once we've said we'll do it, God holds us accountable to that. Okay? Even if it's something that we didn't have to do otherwise. Once we've said we're going to do it, God holds us to that. He holds us to our word. Okay? And so then if we don't do it and follow through, it's a sin. Okay? Regardless of what, even if it's something that was totally our own choice. Right. Okay. Verse 24, if you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in your basket. If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain. What's that about? If you need food, okay, and you go to your neighbor has food, you could eat his food and it's not stealing. That's what this is saying. Okay. But it is saying if you go to your neighbor who has food and you take a bunch of his food and take it home with you, you're stealing. Okay. This is making a distinction here. And as it goes forward, it's going to talk about the responsibilities of people to the poor. That's why it's making this distinction. It's speaking here about the poor. Okay, for a poor person, to take the food they need to survive, God does not consider that a sin. Okay, so Jean Valjean is okay, but for us to take what belongs to another person just so that we can possess it ourselves is stealing. That's the difference. Okay. In fact, God's gonna turn that on his head and say that if I'm starving to death and you have more food than you need and you don't give me any food, you're sinning. You're stealing from me. Okay. So, because again, as we talked about, God's making clear to them, I'm bringing you into this land. It isn't yours to do with as you please. Okay? You're tenants. Okay? I've brought you here. Here's how you are to live. If you don't live that way, I will evict you. Right? And these things that I'm giving you, all these blessings I'm giving you, they aren't yours. They're blessings I'm giving you for you to share with everyone. Okay. Chapter 24, verse 1. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. What's that about? That seems like a weird situation. You'd think you'd want them to get remarried, right, if they've been divorced. The idea here is that contra United States case law for the last 30 or 40 years, marriage is not a contract between two people. Okay? It isn't just an agreement between two human beings where they could break it off and then get back together and then break it off again and go marry someone else and then come back. That's not how marriage works in the eyes of God. Okay? In the eyes of God, marriage, the first one is to be permanent. Okay? There are going to be circumstances where because of human weakness, he's going to allow that to be broken. And even circumstances where he's going to let another one be formed. But in all of those cases, the intent is always that this is going to be permanent. It's not a revolving door. It's not, I don't like her anymore. She wasn't so bad. I'll take her back. That's not how marriage works. Marriage is a more serious thing than that. Okay. Verse 5, if a man is recently married, he must not be sent to war or have any other duty laid on him. For 1 year he is to be free to stay at home and bring happiness to the wife he has married. Notice that last part. Why are you not allowed to put any responsibilities on this man who's been married for 1 year? Because for that first year, all of his responsibilities are to his wife. To please her, to make her happy, to build a home for her. Okay. And so you coming and trying to make him go and work in the field for you, or do this or that, or send him off to war, that's getting in the way of what he owes his wife. Now keep in mind, the idea that a man owes something to his wife for us is duh. But this is the Bronze Age. This is the Bronze Age. The idea that a man owes something to his wife. Not only is she a human being equal and on par with him, but he owes her things as responsibilities to her. Right? We keep reading about all these divorces if a man's wife displeases him. Well, he needs to please her too here. He has a responsibility to please her. Verse 6, do not take a pair of millstones, not even the upper one, as security for a debt, because that would be taking a man's livelihood as security. Well, if you loan someone money, you take collateral, right? You say, you don't pay me back, I'm keeping the collateral. This is using the example of a millstone, right, which might be the most valuable thing a man possesses. He needs money. You loan him the money, you take the millstone. You need 2 millstones to grind grain, because you grind it between the 2 stones. So if I take one of those as collateral, how is he going to make a living? Right? Now this flies in the face of our culture. Our culture, it's, if I loan you money and you don't pay me back, I don't care if you end up on the street. Right? That's your fault for taking a loan you couldn't pay, right? I don't care if you don't have food for your family. I don't care. God's saying that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable. To do to another human being. To put another human being in that position. Where he can't feed his family, where he can't provide for his family, where he can't have a roof over the head of his family, even if it's a tent. Okay, you going and doing that is unacceptable. Verse 7, if a man is caught kidnapping one of his brother Israelites and treats him as a slave or sells him, the kidnapper must die. He must purge the evil from among you. What does that sound like? Joseph's brothers. Right? In cases of leprous diseases, be very careful to do exactly as the priests who are Levites instruct you, but you must follow carefully what I have commanded them. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam along the way after you came out of Egypt. Remember in Leviticus we read all the rules about infectious diseases and leprosy. Okay, we said that the book of Leviticus was directed at the Levites as to how they were to handle things. This is Moses returning to that, say, when these things occur, listen to the Levites because they've received the instructions on how to deal with these kinds of issues. Verse 10, when you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not go into his house to get what he is offering as a pledge. That pledge is like collateral again. Stay outside and let the man to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. If the man is poor, do not go to sleep with his pledge in your possession. Return his cloak to him by sunset so that he may sleep in it. Then he will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act in the sight of the Lord your God. And again, you can't deprive another human being of the basic things he needs to live. Verse 14, do not take advantage of a hired man who is poor and needy, whether he is a brother Israelite or an alien living in one of your towns. Pay him his wages each day before sunset because he is poor and is counting on it. Otherwise he may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. Okay, this is going back to that theme that we've seen before, that God especially listens to these people who are powerless. These strangers and these aliens and orphans and widows who don't have any power in the society. God especially listens to them because no one else does. Verse 16, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers. Each is to die for his own sin. Okay, now this, we're going to back up. Remember, earlier in Deuteronomy, we had that verse that talked about how the children in Israel, the second generation, when they were children, they did not have knowledge of good and evil. And I talked about how in Western forms of Christianity, what's referred to as original sin is this idea that every human being is born guilty of the sin that Adam committed. Okay? And I talked about how that other verse flies in the face of that. Well, here's another one. Here's another one. God says you do not punish a son for a father's sin, let alone a great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson for a great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's sin. Okay? So the idea still held, for example, by the Roman Catholic Church, that a baby that dies without being baptized goes to hell to be punished for all eternity for the sin Adam committed, is not biblical and not Christian. Okay? Right here. God does not punish fathers for their children's sins, nor children for their father's sins. Okay? Each person is responsible. Each person is responsible for what they do.
Earlier in the Old Testament, didn't they punish the parents through the children?
Well, the children, what happens to the children can in and of itself be like a punishment to the parents. I mean, obviously, if your son does something wicked, and does something so wicked and is unrepentant and is stoned to death, that's, you've lost your son.
What I mean is that, the one guy commits a sin and his Canaan's father commits a sin, and so Canaan gets cursed. Because you punish your son, you punish the father by removing his inheritance from him, by cursing his children.
Well, no, Ham didn't receive inheritance from his father because of what Ham did. Okay. Now his children would have suffered for that indirectly. And that they also wouldn't receive the inheritance through him because he didn't receive it. But that's not God punishing directly the children for his sin.
Ham caused the punishment because he didn't do what
Right.
he was told.
He was punished for what he did.
He was
Now,
punished through his children.
Indirectly, right? But the Canaanites, for example, aren't being driven out in front of the Israelites because of what Ham did, but for what they did. Right.
Father,
Yeah.
and in the New Testament, when was it the blind man, the people came to Jesus and said, who sinned, this guy or his parents?
Right.
He was born blind.
The blind man, as he's going into the city, the disciples say to him, who sinned, this man or his father, to cause him to be born blind? Because they don't get it either. But this is reaffirmed. The idea that this was a colloquial idea in Israel is confirmed in Jeremiah 31 when he talks about the new covenant that's coming. Right, this is the old covenant that we're reading that's made with Moses. Jeremiah predicts that there's going to be a new covenant. And he says, you have heard it said, the fathers drink sour wine and the son's teeth are set on edge. But I tell you, in that day, each one will be responsible for their own. So that sort of popular idea that, this person was born deformed or with a disability and therefore their parents must have done something to cause it, was common folklore, obviously. Right, but is everywhere denied by what the Bible says. Yeah.
I have a question there. If the father is not supposed to punish about the child, so the child is not punished for the father. So let's say you have a father who is sinful in nature, worship, basically, as his young child, raises his young child in his thought process, and his child doesn't know anything. The child does something wrong and is punished, not knowing anything different. How does that, it seems to me like the child's guiltless to start with, because he just never was taught.
Kevin asked about what about a child who, because he has a deeply sinful parent or parents, right, is brought up in a way where he isn't brought up with an understanding of right and wrong. And so he goes out and sins. Isn't he effectively being punished for his parents' sinfulness? And that relates to the earlier passage that I referred to. Remember, the reason that the younger generation wasn't held responsible for the sin in the desert was that they didn't have the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? So there comes a point after which each human being is accountable, is accountable for what they do. Okay? And St. Paul in Romans chapter 1 is going to argue that even like the Romans and the Greeks, who had been pagans for dozens and dozens of generations, just from seeing God's creation, seeing the way the world works, had a basic understanding of right and wrong, or should have. They had enough to know that murder was wrong, adultery, theft. They had enough light from God, just from his creation, to know that those things were wrong. And so when they did them, God is justified in saying that was sinful, because they did know, even though they didn't have, the Ten Commandments. They knew that those things were wrong. Would a 3rd century BC Greek be held responsible by God for not having tassels on his garments? I'm going to say no. Okay. Would he be responsible for sleeping with his brother's wife? Yes. Right. Okay, and that has to do with what Christ says, to him who has been given much, from him much is required, and vice versa. So that the child you're talking about is someone who's been given very little to go on. But he's still held responsible for the little that he has. Okay. So verse 17, do not deprive the alien or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. And that is why I command you to do this. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. Okay. So part of this idea that we started with in chapter 22, this idea that we're responsible for our brother, for all of them, right, is that we don't try to squeeze every ounce of profit, every ounce of benefit for ourselves out of our possessions, out of them. Right? The idea that we make sure they're provided for, even at our own expense. Okay. Chapter 25, verse 1. When men have a dispute, they are to take it to court, and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make him lie down and have him flogged in his presence with the number of lashes his crime deserves. But he must not give him more than 40 lashes. If he is flogged more than that, your brother will be degraded in your eyes. Now, oh thanks, you can only flog me 40 times, not 41. But the idea of there being, as we talked about with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, God is setting limits on vengeance. He's setting limits on punishments. Okay? He's not saying everybody who commits a crime gets 40 lashes. He's saying right? This is the maximum. I'm putting a limit. Okay?
Christ was lashed 39 times because under the Roman law, if they'd done it 40 times, they figured they would have killed him.
Yeah. Okay. Verse 4, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Now this is going to become a famous verse in the New Testament because St. Paul quotes it. And St. Paul quotes it to refer to the fact that ministers, that clergy working in local communities ought to be paid by those communities. That seems completely unconnected to oxes and muzzling. But the connection here shows us how, and is how I've been trying to interpret what we've been reading. Right? The idea here, again, is not just a specific thing about what to do with an ox. So we can all ignore it because I don't own an ox. Anybody here own an ox? Okay? The idea here is that, again, why would you muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain? While you're out there plowing with this ox, why would you muzzle it? So it wouldn't eat anything. It wouldn't be able to eat any of the grain. Right? So the idea being, you're using this ox. You're using this ox and not taking care of its basic need to eat, while you're putting it to work. Okay? So if you aren't to do that to an ox, how much less should you do that to a human being? Right? How much less should you take a human being and expect them to work for you or squeeze as much work as you can out of them, paying them as little as possible or nothing? Right? If it's not right to do to an animal, it's certainly not right to do to a human being. And I think that's the idea that's being gotten at here, and I think that's why St. Paul uses it the way he does. Right? He's talking about that idea. You don't do this to an animal. You don't do it to a human being. Verse 5, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. We've talked about this before. It's called levirate marriage. Okay? Where if there's two sons, one of them gets married, dies without having a son to inherit, the second son is then responsible to give a child to that wife who is considered to be the older son's son. We already saw a case, remember, with Judah and Tamar, where this didn't work out so good because the second son said, wait a minute, if I have a son with her, that son will be the firstborn son's son, so he'll inherit everything. Whereas if I don't give her a son, I'll inherit everything. Right? And so he decided to not get her pregnant. Well, what we're about to read is how that kind of situation is to be dealt with. What to do when somebody doesn't want to fulfill that obligation. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Now look at how serious that accusation is too. He does not want to carry on his brother's name in Israel. We talked about how there's not really a strong concept of an afterlife here yet. So you live on through your descendants. So what is this man really denying to his brother? Okay. He's wiping out his brother's family line for his own selfishness so that he'll inherit instead of the son. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Okay. And it adds in the Septuagint, if you have the Orthodox Study Bible, that after she spits in his face, she smacks him in the face with the sandal. Okay. Does that remind you of any videos from 9 years ago at the beginning of the Iraq War?
Oh, yeah,
Remember when they pulled out, they were all hitting him with the It's about as big an insult as you could get. It was then,
Still is.
just like it is now. Okay? Okay, so what this is saying is, listen, pal, you don't want to live up to your responsibilities, publicly shamed. Publicly shamed. You don't get to just go off and do what you want. Okay, everyone is going to know. Everyone is going to know the kind of person who you've chosen to be. Now, remember, this is after the elders have talked to him. Meaning, they've given him plenty of chances to repent. They've given him plenty of chances, said, listen, this is your responsibility to your brother. Listen, this is what you're doing. And he's refusing. And he's refusing. Do you have a...
Well, is there a word for unstandable? Were there a bunch of people later on in the Old Testament that had that name?
Not as a first name. Not as a first name, but it would have been an insult. I mean, it would have been like the Scarlet Letter. You know, the idea that this one, you know, that's the kind of...
I was just wondering what name that would be to see if there were a bunch of people later on.
No, we don't know of anybody. We don't have record of anybody. But, and again, I'm talking about how God's justice, how he rebalances the scales. You know, the idea, you know, so Pharaoh goes out and throws the Israelite infants into the river and strangles them and kills them. And so the Passover happens, and a whole bunch of Egyptian firstborn sons suffer the same fate. The scales are rebalanced. Notice here what the justice is for the person. He's denying his brother his name being carried on. So his punishment is, his name gets carried on all right, but it's as the man who did that. Right. So the punishment fits the crime. Verse 11, if two men are fighting and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband from his assailant, and she reaches out and seizes him by his private parts, you shall cut off her hand. Show her no pity. Now this sounds like something that wouldn't happen very often. I can't imagine that there were 10 or 12 cases a week.
Domestic disputes.
Yeah. But the idea here is that this is not how disputes are to be resolved. Okay? This is not how, and this is just one example of the sort of attrition you can have, where things turn into feuds. Right? Like the Hatfields and the McCoys. Right? Where something starts out as an argument, then it turns into a fist fight. Now somebody's a eunuch, right? Okay? But this isn't just a singular case. It's showing that escalation, right? That escalation has to be stopped. That escalation has to be stopped. Okay? We've already been told several times how disputes are to be resolved. You go before the judges, they render a verdict, and you follow it, period. Right? These kind of feuds and escalations can't happen. Verse 13, do not have two differing weights in your bag, one heavy and one light. Do not have two differing measures in your house, one large, one small. You must have accurate and honest weights and measures, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. For the Lord your God detests anyone who does these things, anyone who deals dishonestly. We've read about, so many shekels of silver and that kind of thing. The way things were measured out, by weight at this time, was using basically crude balance beams. And so you would have a weight on one side, and you would say, okay, this weighs a shekel, and you put that on that side, and then you measure out so many shekels of metal, right, of silver or gold or what have you. If you were doing grain, it would be these measures that they're referring to, which would be sort of like a scoop. Right, or a cup, right? You would say, here's an ephah of flour, right? This is an ephah cup. So what does it mean? Obviously, if you have two different ones, I have this ephah cup that's this big, and this ephah cup that's this big, right? Or I have this shekel weight that's this big, and this shekel weight that's this big, Right? It's talking about being dishonest in business. Right? It's talking about being dishonest in business and taking advantage. And later on, there's going to be what's called the temple shekel, where they're going to have an official weight at the temple. Because remember, if any dispute can't be resolved, you ultimately go to the temple. The temple in Jerusalem, they're going to have an official temple shekel weight. And so if someone is accused of fiddling with it, they take the official temple shekel weight and your shekel weight and put them on either sides, and it had better balance out, right? So verse 17, remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on that journey and cut off all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. Okay. I think we could do chapter 26. Chapter 26, verse 1. When you have entered the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance and have taken possession of it and settled in it, take some of the first fruits of all that you produce from the soil of the land the Lord your God is giving you, and put them in a basket. Then go to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, and say to the priest in office at the time, I declare today to the Lord your God that I have come to the land the Lord swore to our forefathers to give us. The priest shall take the basket from your hands and set it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. Then you shall declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people, and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, putting us to hard labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with miraculous signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, O Lord, have given me. Place the basket before the Lord your God and bow down before him. And you and the Levites and the aliens among you shall rejoice in all the good things the Lord your God has given to you in your household. So, what this is getting at is this time, these first fruits. When the harvest comes in, you take the first portion, the best portion. You collect it, and you bring it as an offering to God. But what do you do when you bring it as an offering before God? You recount this story. Right? You say, my father was a wandering Aramean. Who's that referring to? Abraham. Right? He was a wanderer. He and his family went down into Egypt. They were just this small family. They became a mighty nation. We were enslaved. God delivered us. He brought us here to this land. And now, in thankfulness, I bring this to him. Okay? This is the origin of, amongst other things, the Slavic custom of bringing the baskets full of food at Pascha, at Easter. Right? And bringing them and setting them in front of the altar. Okay? But the idea is larger than that. Whenever we bring offerings to God, whether it be what we put in the offering plate, whether it be communion that we offer, the bread and wine that we offer, we call it the Eucharist, right? Which is from the Greek word that means thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. We come and we bring it, and what happens in the liturgy? We recount our story. Right? Which was, I was a sinner and I was a wanderer estranged from God. God became a man, Jesus Christ. He walked among us. We killed him, but he rose again on the third day. And he's now brought us up into heaven. He's seated at the right hand of God. We recount the story. Right? When we offer the thanksgiving. And it's in thanksgiving for that story, for what God has done for us in Christ, that we offer whatever we offer. Whether it's money, whether it's ourselves and our lives, whether it's the bread and wine in the Eucharist that we're going to receive. Everything we offer in thanksgiving for that. And that's why in the liturgy we tell that story again, because of this right here. To remind ourselves. To remind ourselves. It's not just some sense of duty that I'm coming here and putting my $10 in the plate. Right? It's not just because it's a good thing to do. It's because I'm thankful for what Christ did for me. Verse 12, when you have finished setting aside 1/10 of all your produce in the 3rd year, the year of the tithe, you shall give it to the Levite, the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. Then say to the Lord your God, I have removed from my house the sacred portion and have given it to the Levite, the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all you commanded. I have not turned aside from your commands, nor have I forgotten any of them. I have not eaten any of the sacred portion while I was in mourning, nor have I removed any of it while I was unclean, nor have I offered any of it to the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God. I have done everything you commanded me. Look down from heaven, your holy dwelling place, and bless your people Israel and the land you have given us, as you promised on oath to our forefathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. So there's the second piece. The first piece is we give offerings and thanksgiving to God. The second piece is we give offerings to the priests and to the poor. And these are of a piece. These are not two separate things. These are not two separate ideas.
Because the priests are poor.
Well, not just because the priests are poor, but because what we give to the poor around us, we're acknowledging the same thanksgiving as when we give it back to God. All right? We're saying the same thing. Okay. To quote the old Protestant hymn, speaking of the Puritans, that I as a kid always at least used to sing on Thanksgiving, was we give thee but thine own, whatever the gift may be. Anything we give to God already belongs to God. Right? He entrusted it to us, but it was never ours. We're not giving him anything of ours. Right? That's why when the body of Christ is lifted up, right before we receive communion, thine own of thine own we offer unto thee. We're not offering God something of ours. He doesn't need anything of ours. We're offering him Christ. We're offering him back everything that he's given to us in thanksgiving. Verse 16, the Lord your God commands you this day to follow these decrees and laws, carefully observe them with all your heart and with all your soul. You have declared this day that the Lord is your God, and that you will walk in his ways, that you will keep his decrees, commands, and laws, and that you will obey him. And the Lord has declared this day that you are his people, his treasured possession, as he promised, and that you are to keep all his commands. He has declared that he will set you in praise, fame, and honor high above all the nations he has made, and that you will be a people holy to the Lord your God as he promised. I think I'll go ahead and end there for this evening. I didn't get quite as far as I hoped, so I didn't get back to your question. But next week, Lord willing, we're going to get back to that in chapter 28. So next week, we'll pick up in chapter 27. Deuteronomy ends in chapter 34. I don't think we'll make it at the pace we've been going. So it may be 2 weeks yet that we're in Deuteronomy, but we'll see. We'll see. We may be able to get done, but we'll see. And then we'll be into Joshua, where we'll have some blood and guts and battle, and then we'll get into Judges, where we'll have even more blood and guts and battle, and then we'll take a break and we'll get into Ruth, which is more like a soap opera. So we'll have something for everybody in the next few.
Do you have any visual aid?
There will at least be maps and bad drawings.
Oh, that's not right.
So thank you, everybody.